From the Toronto Star, I'm Adrian Cheung, and this matters. The Canadian airline industry, a sector worth more than $17 billion in revenue, is grounded. Can it be saved? The biggest airlines in the country, Air Canada, WestJet, Air Transit, along with smaller regional ones, have all taken massive losses in the last year. Tens of thousands of employees in the industry have already been laid off, with new rounds being announced every month.
Pilots haven't flown in 7 months. Air traffic controllers can't certify because there's not enough air traffic in the air. How are we going to feed our families?
International and business travel is non-existent. Flight routes canceled. And Canada's new travel rules, by design, is making flying less than appealing, as worries about COVID variants keep rising. On This Matters, we're talking to Robert Kokonis, founder and managing director of AirTrav, an aviation consulting firm. We're talking about what this means for anyone with thoughts of flying in the future, and whether a federal bailout can help the industry reach altitude again. Robert, nice to have you on the podcast. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me.
You have decades of experience in the airline industry. You've been there for the ups and the downs. You've seen how this industry has changed. And right now, 2021, is this the biggest down the airline industry has ever faced?
By far. And I was not going to use the word unprecedented because I think we're all sort of getting tired of that. But insofar as the aviation and tourism industry, nothing compares. Of course, we had 9/11 and airspace was shut down, especially over the North Atlantic. But, roughly speaking, a week. We had SARS that mostly impacted Asia-Pacific flights to Canada. We had the volcanic eruption over Iceland that sort of killed transatlantic travel for the better space of about a week and a half or so. And then we also had the global financial crisis, which actually hit really more cargo airlines than passenger. But there's been no instance where we have literally seen the spigots of revenue and demand from passengers fall to close to zero almost overnight. So this is tough. And it's not just the fact that the spigots were turned off. We're now, into the 12th month of this shutdown, and that's the big problem.
Looking at some of the situations for each of the Canadian airlines, the layoff numbers are staggering. 20,000 last year for Air Canada. That's been followed by thousands more this year. That's true for WestJet as well. Just how dire is the financial situation?
It's pretty tough. There was a stat published by the National Airlines Council of Canada. That body represents 4 airlines: Air Canada, WestJet, Sunwing, and Jazz, which of course is a big feed carrier for Air Canada regionally. And they've got a stat, there's over 630,000 jobs in this country, which are linked to air transport in the tourism sector. And you're right, we saw tens of thousands of layoffs last year, but there's also hidden job layoffs. We don't necessarily see that much. The tour operator that lays off people, the kayak outfitter at Lake Louise in Alberta. There's been a number of travel agencies, for example, Flight Centre, owned by a big Australian company. They've got a large presence in Canada. They've shut down a great number of their storefronts, including in the greater Toronto and Hamilton region. And then, of course, as we got into January, the new year, further government restrictions on arrivals, people arriving by air into this country, has really squelched demand further.
As soon as possible in the coming weeks, we will be introducing mandatory PCR testing at the airport for people returning to Canada. Travelers will then have to wait for up to 3 days at an approved hotel for their test results at their own expense, which is expected to be more than $2,000.
So both Air Canada and WestJet laying off further people. So when all is said and done, the toll from this easily over 100,000 people, easily.
And especially considering, as you mentioned, those new travel restrictions imposed by the Canadian government. And that really is a big disincentive for people to travel, obviously, during this time. In the long-term health, let's say, even the next 6 to 8 months, 12 months, are Canadian airlines at risk of bankruptcy?
And when we talk about Canadian Airlines, of course, all the optics are on the big players, but don't forget we have a wide range of regional carriers, a lot of them not aligned with WestJet or with the Air Canada family, flying in the West and the Maritimes and in Ontario. And I think there's a very, very real chance that we could see somebody either go into bankruptcy protection, try to restructure and come back out, or to fail outright. And it doesn't stop there. Some of our nation's airports, we only have international arrivals allowed to fly into Toronto, Montreal, Calgary, and Vancouver. We have got some regional airports, for example, in New Brunswick, especially Moncton and Fredericton are in tough shape, St. John as well, Charlottetown, in the West, places like Regina. There's nobody landing. And the financial model our country's airports operate in, since there was a handover from the federal government to local not-for-profit airport authorities back in the 1990s, and those airports work on a user fee basis. So when airplanes land and when passengers go through their airports and use their services, they generate money. But a lot of these airports get on their financial statements used to grow their terminals, to add services. They can't service that debt when there's no revenues coming in. So to answer your question again, it's not just airlines, maybe a couple of big ones potentially at risk, but a number of regional carriers, as well as airports and other players in the food chain. I might add just one statistic that the International Air Transport Association, of which Transat and Air Canada, for example, are members, they represent 285 airlines around the world, the biggest airline trade body. And they were back in maybe October, November, they were forecasting airline cash burn this year, 2021, somewhere around $35-40 billion. They've recently upped that to $75 to $95 billion of cash pain. Way worse last year. The International Civil Aviation Organization, ICAO, estimates that all airlines globally lost $370 billion. That's airlines, airports losing a further $115 billion amongst other parties. So, those numbers are so big, I can't think that high. And there's just no way that, given the status quo, still no fundamental government support package from Ottawa, and we're hanging there. And I think as a result, we are going to see some bankruptcies and potentially some outright failures.
We'll be right back. What should the federal government be doing right now to step in? Unions and experts in the aviation industry have said that a bailout of some kind has to happen. There has been some talk of the transport minister that is in the pipeline, but what should that federal aid package actually look like?
Well, first of all, historically, aid from Ottawa was first hinted somewhere around September, October, and then formally it was announced early November by then Transport Minister Marc Garneau that help was on the way, and talks were going to start with our airlines shortly thereafter. Talks didn't start happening until close to Christmas, but the government is sticking hard to a few conditions, such as any remaining refunds to passengers, trying to ensure certain levels of service on regional routes, air routes, and regional air routes have really suffered badly since Air Canada took some cuts back last year, then WestJet, and further cuts. And then other covenants such as airline executives can't take bonuses and you can't use aid to buy back stocks. There's a bunch of things in play now, but for all that talk and bravado, still there's nothing. The problem I've got with that stance is this. I understand there are some wants, there's some asks from the government side of the negotiating table. But when you're the government and you effectively turn off the taps and our sources of revenue, case in point, when the Prime Minister a few weeks ago came outside of Rideau Cottage and announced that
Air Canada, WestJet, Sunwing, and Air Transat are cancelling air service to all Caribbean destinations and Mexico starting this Sunday up until April 30th.
I mean, that was devastating because we have a couple of seasonal peaks in this country, Christmas and the March break period, and to lose all those flights with nobody to say, well, we're going to help you out financially, that hurts me. And we're about the only major Western economy that has yet to come to the direct aid of our aviation sector. And we have other airlines flying to Canada right now who have received aid and unfairly are using that aid to prop up the number of flights they fly to Canada, hence stealing market share from our carriers. I've got a problem with that. So it's unfathomable that we've yet to see an aid package from the government.
About the bailout package then, what should that look like in your mind?
First of all, I really hate the word bailout. I mean, if we go back maybe to the global financial crisis, the governments of Canada and the US providing pretty large bailouts for the auto sector, some of that was paid back and some wasn't. In the case of the airline industry, we've been asking two key asks. One is we're asking for low interest loan guarantees. So just for people listening to understand how that works, it would mean that the government of Canada would be guaranteeing the loan. So if my airline were to apply for a low interest loan from a financial institution or some other party, the government of Canada would act as the guarantor. So they're not paying any money to the airlines. They're only on the hook if I fail. But again, if we can get directed aid to these airlines, we're hopefully going to mitigate the likelihood of somebody failing. So low interest loan guarantee support from the government. The second thing is that we've been advocating for a faster rollout of rapid testing at airports across the country to keep the aviation system moving and also to prepare for the return of larger scale travel. And I tell you, a lot of these employees working for the airlines, the airports, travel agencies, tour operators, they are going to have long memories in this when we next have a federal elections. The Liberal Party of this country best think about that when it comes to getting an aid package rolled out.
I also wonder about how these costs get passed down to travelers because, again, we see headlines about Air Canada taking over air transit, aka, fewer airlines to operate, less competition. Does that eventually mean higher ticket prices or costs passed down to travelers? How does that usually shake out?
That's a great question. A little bit specific from COVID because Air Canada made a pitch for Transat Corporation way back in May of 2019, and still the transaction is not finalized. This is really just economics 101. Anytime there was a merger or an acquisition, if you reduce the amount of competition in any given market, whether it's for airline seats or some other commodity, because really an airline seat is a commodity, it's inherently price driven. Anytime you reduce competition, you reduce price supply or price competition, fares will go up. Now, I don't think we're going to see, if the merger happens tomorrow, I don't think we're going to see any real effects until maybe next year when the airlines get back to what could be construed to be back to a sort of a normal schedule, way below where we were in 2019, but at least a bit more normal than where we are today. At that point, we might start to see some effects of, okay, you and your partner are trying to buy a sun package vacation in Jamaica or Cuba, and perhaps the prices are up a little bit over where they were a couple of years ago. I mean, that was something, for example, the Competition Bureau of Canada weighed in on the Transat Air Canada merger back last year, and they came out to advise against it because the amount of market share Air Canada and Transat had combined was quite significant to sun destinations and quite significant across the Atlantic Ocean to Europe during the summertime. But, the fact that WestJet Vacations will still be there, Sunwing will still be there, although both of them have been hurt badly by COVID as well. So, it's really hard to say where we'll be. We don't even know at this point whether Air Canada will bring back its Rouge lower cost subsidiary. Rouge was formed back in 2013 to provide Air Canada a means to serve highly competitive destinations with a little bit lower cost product to stay competitive from a price standpoint. It was generally successful, but for the time being, because of that stoppage of sun destination flights until April 30th, Rouge for the second time now has been fully shut down. They were shut down until November, took to the skies again, and they're shut down again. So who knows? We could see Rouge disappear altogether.
There's a real compression of some of the lines that exist, and I know that there's been a reduction in service of a lot of routes as well. I know it's sort of hard to envision right now with how hard the industry has been hit, and there's still so much uncertainty ahead. And so maybe this is a question more for a few years down the road. But in your mind, what do you think recovery, that word recovery, what does that look like for the Canadian airline industry?
If you took us back to perhaps April of last year, airline industry globally and here in Canada, we were talking about a 3-year recovery to get back to 2019 levels. But the devastation has exceeded anything any of us could have estimated. So now we're talking about a 5 to 6 year recovery, and that recovery may not be to 2019 levels. It might be back to 2017 levels. And a lot of people forget, the airline industry is, always, if you read letters to the editor or online comments, is always a convenient target for a lot of people. They hate Air Canada, or they hate WestJet, or they hate travel, or whatever. But let's not forget that, especially when you get outside of our big hub airports, air transport is the glue that binds a lot of smaller communities to the rest of the world. Is connectivity for passengers, is connectivity for cargo. Even some of our regional airports, they exist to have runways to accept firefighting crews, logistics, other types of required movements. So it's not just the threat of aviation in Canada, but it's also the threat of connectivity for trade and for cargo and other services between Canada and the rest of the world. And if we don't have a strong and healthy system, is going to be a problem.
Robert, thanks for taking the time to talk to us and for sharing your thoughts on this.
You're welcome. I appreciate the attention you want to put on this subject.
And that's Robert Kokonis, founder and managing director of AirTrav. That's it for today. Thanks for listening. This Matters is hosted and produced by me, Adrian Cheung, Saba Aitazaz, and Raju Mutar. Produced and mixed by Sean Pattinen, and our director of programming is JP Fozo. Our show theme music is by So Called, and our episode music is by Mike DeAngelis. We want to hear what stories matter to you. Please send us comments, questions, or ideas to thismatters@thestar.ca. Please consider supporting the journalism the Toronto Star newsroom does at thestar.com. And don't forget to subscribe to This Matters on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Let's talk soon.